And China shelves a proposed region-wide security and economics deal in the Pacific. Some island nations raised concerns about the plan, wanted changes or a delay.
Let's take a deeper dive into China's Pacific strategy. And to do that, we're going to speak to Raffaello Pantucci. He's from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He joins us now. Mr. Pantucci, let's take a closer look at this proposition from Beijing, because it's a rather large one for the country, and it radically sort of changes this vision that China has vis-a-vis the Pacific Island nations. It involves security issues, economics, as well as politics of the South Pacific. To what extent, though, do you think that these Pacific Island nations might get agreement with China on all of these issues, on this proposal?
Frankly, I think they struggle, and I think the Chinese will struggle to get a coherent agreement from everybody in the region on the proposals that they're putting forwards. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think the largest, the most obvious one is the fact that these countries have no desire to get pulled into a kind of tussle between the United States and China, which is very much how this agreement has been framed. I think China's made it very clear that it sees this, as part of a geopolitical game. I think that geopolitical game has a number of levels. I think on the one hand, it's about sort of expanding its influence in this region and causing Australia some consternation and causing the United States some consternation. But then also it's a wider geopolitical push in terms of trying to win more votes, frankly, in the United Nations. Each of these are countries with a vote in the UN, like every other country on the planet. And so by, winning their favor, China is expanding its sort of influence. And the issue from these countries' perspective is that they don't really care that much about these geopolitical tussles. They have lots of development issues at home, and they suffer from really the world's most pressing security challenge, which often is under address, which is climate change. A lot of these countries are going to disappear if the waters rise. And frankly, from their perspective, that should be the priority. They don't want to find themselves getting bogged down into some sort of geopolitical tussle. Now, of course, the degree to which there is a willingness to focus on that, or they're more interested in focusing on China, varies from country to country. And I think that's why you saw the Chinese coming with a big proposal, because they thought there was some appetite in some capitals, but obviously there wasn't appetite in all the capitals, and that's why we've seen no agreement.
We have seen some interest, though, from some of those Pacific Island nations, nonetheless, Mr. Pantucci, and despite the fact that they might not want to get involved in those political tussles as you framed them, there is the prospect of economic gain as well. The FTA, as an example, that China has offered to the Pacific Island nations, it would offer them this unprecedented access to a massive market within China, 1.4 billion people. How attractive might that be, though, to these island nations?
Look, I think any sort of market access like that is attractive. I would also say that, China has form in offering these kinds of agreements in lots of different areas. And there's always a, variance in the degree to which the depth of the kind of free trade agreements. And I think we haven't seen the detail of this one specifically, but, just getting access to the Chinese market is not necessarily the be all and end all from these countries' perspective. I don't know how productive they are in material terms. I think from their perspective, they're probably looking for more material support in terms of helping develop their infrastructure and helping develop their nations to make them more sort of productive. And that's probably what they're more interested in, rather than sort of grand free trade areas, which take a long time to agree to and ultimately don't necessarily always deliver what is hoped for.
Well, infrastructure ability, that's something that China has a great deal of experience with. It's doing that within its own country. It's doing it with One Belt, One Road as well around the region. You mentioned before that climate change issues, that might be something, it might be an area where Beijing might have some influence. It too has a great number of projects on board. Could it not offer something to these Pacific Island nations in terms of a vision, in terms of climate action?
I think China will undoubtedly do that. And I think really the only answer to the climate change problem is if everybody works together to deal with it, everybody on the planet. So I think, frankly, China coming on board, showing that is very important. I would also say that the recent Australian elections probably plays a role in the discussions that we're seeing here, because I think the previous administration we saw in Canberra was one that, was more maybe skeptical towards climate change issues than the new Labour government, which has shown itself to be much more forward leaning. And the fact that we've seen Canberra very quickly send the foreign minister, Penny Wong, or foreign secretary, out to the region to engage with counterparts, I think is a reflection of how much the new administration in Canberra is specifically trying to reach out to these island nations. And that, I'm sure, will have played into their thinking about how much they want to find themselves sort of signing over fully to China. Ultimately, the climate change issues are only going to get resolved if all of these countries play together and try to do something about it. So I think that's always going to be important. I think the element that you've touched upon, which is important from a Chinese-specific perspective, is the infrastructure one. And there, China does come offering something very attractive. But I think from the Pacific, from these islands and from these countries' perspective, they don't really want to choose. They want all of these options to be available to them. And they don't really want to find themselves in a situation that they've sort of signed an agreement with one nation, which excludes everybody else or causes them issues with others, because that only puts them in a very difficult position, which they don't really want to be in.
So this wide-ranging deal, it isn't dead in the water. China will want to calibrate, it will want to perhaps look at the requested changes, some of the calibration that these Pacific Island nations might want. What does China need to do to get everybody on board? Do you think it even can?
I think it would struggle, frankly, because I think the way that this whole debate has been framed now would make it very difficult for Beijing to sort of enable the kind of wide-ranging agreement that they've initially proposed. I suspect what you'll see is a sort of more watered-down version, and then a lot more effort from Beijing on the bilateral side of engaging with each of these countries separately and trying to find ways of getting different agreements, similar to what we've seen in the Solomon Islands, in other places as well. A sort of region-wide agreement might be a bit too far, into the scope and scale that they're talking about at the moment. However, you could see, some quite substantial agreements being struck with some of the countries and leaving some of the others aside. So I think what you'll see is China trying to recalibrate itself and trying to refocus on the individual nations, as well as trying to find out how it can sort of best present some regional package at the same time without, going as far as they had initially.
Mr. Pantucci, thank you very much for that. Mr. Raffaello Pantucci there from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.